A risky bet, an unlikely marriage, a transformation no one expected. When the truth comes to light, everything can change in an instant. Before discovering this emotional story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more surprising tales. The sound of Valentina's heels echoed through the mirrored corridors of the luxurious shopping center. She walked with the impeccable posture of someone born for the runway, her red dress drawing the attention of everyone around her. Richard. Martin observed the scene from a distance, seated at his table in the most exclusive restaurant in the mall. His face remained impassive, but his hands gripped the linen napkin under the table with force. The model, his fiancée of 2 years, hadn't noticed his presence. She was completely absorbed in conversation with Gabriel Montgomery, the current heartthrob of American soap operas. Her laughter echoed through the space, while her hands occasionally touched the actor's arm in gestures that conveyed much more than simple friendship. Richard, CEO of the largest fashion conglomerate in North America, Martin Fashion Group, felt his world crumble when he saw Valentina lean in and passionately kiss Gabriel. The moment was captured by dozens of cell phones around them, and within minutes, social media exploded with news of the incident. "So this is how it ends," he murmured to himself, rising from the table without touching his coffee. His assistant Mark was already at his side, trying to create an escape route from the paparazzi who were beginning to gather at the shopping center entrance. That same evening, during a charity event he couldn't miss due to business commitments, Richard found himself surrounded by pitying looks and poorly disguised whispers. It was then that Edward Villiers, his biggest rival in the fashion market, approached with a provocative smile. "Bad luck for you, Martin," commented Villiers, swirling his champagne glass. "But perhaps it's a sign that you never truly belong to our elite. After all, creating a successful brand is one thing, but having class, well, that's something that comes from the cradle." Richard felt his blood boil. "What exactly are you insinuating, Villiers? Just that maybe you should have stayed in your place of origin. All this business of transforming ordinary people into style icons, it's a fantasy. You can dress someone in the finest clothes, but true elegance can't be bought." It was then that Richard, driven by wounded pride and a few too many glasses of champagne, did something unthinkable. "Want to bet?" The room fell silent, and several guests moved closer to hear better. "I bet I can transform any person into a high society lady in 30 days, declared Richard, his voice laden with challenge. "Someone completely outside our social circle, and not just that, I'll marry this person." Villiers laughed loudly. "And what do you gain from this besides more humiliation?" "If I succeed, you sell your stake in Villiers Fashion to me, at a price I'll determine," proposed Richard, knowing he was touching on his rival's weak point, who was having financial problems. "And if you lose, you get 30% of Martin Fashion Group shares." The murmuring in the room increased. It was an absurd bet that could cost billions. Villiers extended his hand, and Richard shook it, sealing the deal in front of dozens of witnesses from high society. The next morning, with a clearer head and a hangover setting in, Richard drove through downtown Boston in his black Porsche. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for until he saw her, a young woman sitting on a park bench reading a worn book. Despite her simple and worn clothes, there was something in her posture that caught his attention. She must have been about 25, brown hair tied in a messy bun, and even seated, she maintained a natural dignity that intrigued Richard. He parked his car and approached, observing that the book in her hands was Pride and Prejudice. "Jane Austen," he commented, making the young woman look up. "Yes," she replied, carefully closing the book. "You know it?" "I read it in college," he said, noticing that despite her precarious situation, her green eyes conveyed sharp intelligence. "What's your name?" "Helen," she replied hesitantly. "And you're Richard Martin. I recognize your face from magazines." Us smiled, surprised. "And what is a Jane Austen reader doing here in this park?" "Surviving," Helen answered simply. "Life doesn't always give us what we plan for." Richard sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "And what if I offered you a chance to completely change your life?" Helen stared at him with suspicion. What kind of chance? An agreement, a temporary marriage, for 30 days. In exchange, you'll receive training, clothes, education, and at the end, a considerable sum of money to restart your life however you wish. Why me? She asked, her voice firm despite the surreal proposal. Because you have something that can't be taught. Dignity, answered Richard, surprising himself with his own sincerity. Helen was silent for a few moments, considering the proposal. I have some conditions, she finally said, which are? I want to create a social project to help homeless people, and I want autonomy to develop it my way. Richard observed her with new interest. He hadn't expected such a direct negotiation. I accept, but I also have a condition. You'll have to trust me completely during these 30 days. You'll need to learn a lot in a short time. Helen extended her hand. We have a deal then. When their hands touched, neither of them imagined that handshake would change their lives forever. Richard led her to his car, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. As he drove toward his penthouse in the most upscale neighborhood of Boston, he observed Helen's determined expression in the rearview mirror. Are you sure about this? He asked. Helen looked out the car window, observing the city that had always treated her with indifference. I am. Sometimes we need to accept crazy proposals to make the difference we've always dreamed of. The sun was setting on the Boston horizon, painting the sky in orange hues as the Porsche cut through the streets toward the beginning of a story that neither of them could predict. Richard's penthouse duplex occupied the top 2 floors of one of Boston's most exclusive buildings. When the private elevator doors opened, Helen felt momentarily dizzy with the luxury surrounding her. The entrance hall, decorated with contemporary artwork and designer furniture, was larger than any place she had ever lived. Your home is? She hesitated, searching for the right word. Impressive. Richard observed her reaction with interest. Unlike most people who entered there for the first time, Helen didn't show excessive amazement, just contained curiosity. Sandra, called Richard, and a middle-aged woman dressed in a discreet uniform appeared immediately. This is Helen. She'll be staying with us. Please prepare the guest room in the East Wing and arrange everything she needs for a bath. Yes, sir, Sandra replied, casting a curious glance at Helen before withdrawing. First, let's establish some rules, said Richard, leading Helen to the living room. From now on, you'll have intensive classes in etiquette, diction, fashion, and social behavior. Your schedule will be controlled minute by minute. Helen nodded, sitting cautiously on an Italian leather armchair. And when do we start with the social project? Richard raised an eyebrow. You don't waste time, do you? Every day on the street is a day lost for someone who needs help, she replied simply. Before Richard could respond, the private elevator announced someone's arrival. The doors opened, revealing an elegant woman of approximately 50 years old. Victoria, Richard introduced. My image consultant and etiquette specialist. She will be your primary mentor. Victoria examined Helen from head to toe with critical eyes. We have a lot of work ahead of us, she declared, but I see potential. First, we need to take care of basic appearance. Then, we'll start with posture and behavior lessons. The following hours were a whirlwind. Helen was taken to an exclusive spa in the building itself, where she underwent various treatments. Her nails were done, her hair treated and cut, her skin received special care. When she finally looked in the mirror hours later, she barely recognized the person staring back at her. This is just the beginning, said Victoria, who supervised every detail. Tomorrow we'll start with the actual lessons, and in the evening you'll have your first test, a formal dinner with Richard and some important guests. Helen felt butterflies in her stomach. So soon. We don't have time to waste, Victoria replied. 30 days pass very quickly. Back at the penthouse, Helen found her room, or rather her suite, completely transformed. The closet was stocked with new clothes from various famous brands, all in her size. How did you manage all this so quickly? She asked, impressed. I have an efficient team, Richard replied, who had just entered the room, and unlimited resources. Now I need you to prepare for dinner. Victoria has set aside what you should wear. When Richard left, Helen examined the chosen dress, an elegant, discreet navy blue model. As she dressed, she noticed her hands trembling slightly. It was as if she were about to go on stage in a play for which she hadn't rehearsed. At 8 o'clock sharp, Helen came down to the dining room. Richard was conversing with a small group of people, all impeccably dressed. When he saw her, his eyes widened for a moment. "Helen," he called, extending his hand toward her, "come meet some friends." She walked over to him, remembering Victoria's instructions about posture. Richard introduced her to the group, a couple of entrepreneurs, an influential politician and his wife, and a famous social columnist. "So Helen," began the columnist Fernando Torres, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Richard told us you're an appreciator of classic literature." "Yes," she answered, keeping her voice steady, "particularly Jane Austen." "Interesting choice," commented the politician's wife. "What's your opinion on how Austen portrays social differences in her works?" Helen felt all eyes on her. It was clearly a test. "I believe Austen was brilliant in showing how a person's worth goes far beyond their social position," she responded. "Elizabeth Bennet, for example, wins Darcy over not through her fortune or status, but through her intelligence and authenticity." A silence followed her answer, broken by Richard. "Shall we sit down? Dinner is served." During the meal, Helen managed to maintain her composure, remembering the basic instructions Victoria had given her about which utensil to use and how to behave. Occasionally she felt Richard's gaze upon her, but couldn't decipher his expression. After dinner, when the guests had already departed, Richard found her on the balcony, observing the city lights. "You did well," he said, stopping beside her. "They were testing me," Helen replied, "and they will continue to test you. Each person you meet in the coming weeks will be a new challenge." Helen turned to face him. "Why are you really doing this, Richard? It can't just be because of a bet." He was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe I want to prove something to myself," he finally answered. "Or maybe I'm just tired of seeing people like Villiers dictating who belongs or doesn't belong in certain circles. And I'm your social experiment." "You're much more than that," he said, surprising them both with the sincerity in his voice. "You're someone who, even with everything against you, maintained your dignity and principles. That's something many of my acquaintances, with all their fortunes, never managed to achieve." The night wind blew stronger, making Helen shiver slightly. Richard took off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders, an automatic gesture that seemed to surprise them both. "Tomorrow your day starts at 6 a.m., he said, regaining his composure. "Victoria will be relentless." "I'm ready," Helen replied, and there was a determination in her voice that made Richard smile. As she retired to her room, Richard remained on the balcony, thinking about how this woman, who less than 24 hours ago was living on the streets, already demonstrated more natural class than many people he had known for years. Perhaps, he thought, this bet was more than simple revenge against Villiers. Perhaps it was the beginning of something much greater. The following days transformed into a learning marathon for Helen. Her mornings invariably began at 6 a.m. With posture and movement classes with Victoria, the consultant was rigorous but efficient. "Straight back," Victoria commanded, as Helen walked across the room with 3 books balanced on her head. A society lady doesn't slouch, she floats. The afternoons were dedicated to etiquette classes, art history, fashion, and social behavior. Helen absorbed each piece of information with a thirst for knowledge that impressed her instructors. At night, when she finally retired to her room, her feet ached from constant training in high heels, but her mind buzzed with everything she had learned. On her 5th day in the penthouse during breakfast, Richard surprised her with news. "This afternoon you'll have your first wedding dress fitting," he announced, without taking his eyes off the tablet where he was reading the day's news. Helen almost choked on her tea. So soon. "The wedding will be in 3 weeks, he replied. "Everything needs to be perfect. The press will be present." "The press?" Helen felt her stomach turn. "I thought it would be something discreet." Richard finally looked at her. "Nothing in my life is discreet, Helen. Every move I make is news, and now every move you make will be too." As if to prove his point, at that moment Sandra entered the dining room with several magazines and newspapers. The headlines jumped out. "Richard Martin, the betrayed billionaire, will present new fiancée soon." Who is the mysterious woman seen entering the CEO of Martin Fashion's penthouse? Valentina Torres, Richard's ex, seen kissing actor in Miami. Helen picked up one of the magazines, observing a blurry photo of her entering Richard's building. They don't even know who I am yet, but they soon will, said Richard. That's why we need to get ahead of this. This afternoon, after the dress fitting, we'll give your first official interview. What? Helen dropped the magazine. But I'm not ready. Victoria says you're progressing faster than expected, he replied. Besides, the longer we delay, the more speculation will arise. That afternoon, Helen found herself in one of Boston's most exclusive ateliers. The location had been closed especially for her, and 3 of the country's most renowned designers presented their proposals for the dress. This is an exclusive Valentino, explained Madame Teresa, an elegant lady who had flown directly from Paris for the occasion, made especially for you. Helen observed her reflection in the mirror. The dress was stunning, with delicate laces and embroidery that seemed to float over the fabric. But something didn't seem right. It's beautiful, she said, hesitantly, but it's not you, Richard completed, observing everything from an armchair in the corner. You want something more meaningful, Helen completed. Something that represents not just luxury but purpose. The designers exchanged confused glances, but Richard smiled. Do you have an idea in mind? What if, Helen began, her eyes shining with inspiration, we created something that incorporated artisanal elements, work done by artisans from disadvantaged communities? We could transform the dress into a symbol of the social project we want to develop. A silence followed her suggestion, broken by the sound of slow clapping coming from the door. It was Victoria. Now, said the consultant, you're thinking like a true society leader, not just about looking good, but about making a difference. The following hours were dedicated to developing the concept of the dress. Helen discovered she had a natural eye for design, and her suggestions were not only creative but deeply meaningful. In the late afternoon, when the time came for the interview, Helen was surprisingly calm. The journalist, an elegant middle-aged woman, was received at the penthouse. So, Helen, began the reporter, how did you meet Richard Martin? Helen looked at Richard, who nodded slightly. They had prepared a version of the story that, while not completely true, wasn't entirely false either. We met through a social project I'm developing, Helen replied. Richard showed interest in supporting initiatives that make a difference in people's lives. And was it love at first sight? Helen smiled, remembering Victoria's instructions on how to appear natural before the cameras. It was more like a mutual recognition. Sometimes we meet people who make us see the world differently. The interview continued to flow naturally. Helen spoke about her plans for the social project, about her passion for literature, and about how she saw fashion's role as a tool for social transformation. When the journalist finally departed, Richard approached Helen. You were extraordinary, he said, his voice carrying a tone of admiration she had never heard before. I was just honest, Helen replied. As much as possible. That's exactly what makes you special, said Richard, his eyes fixed on hers. You transform even an artificial situation into something genuine. For a moment they were silent, aware of a growing tension between them. Helen was the first to break eye contact. I need to review some things with Victoria, she said, turning to leave. Helen, Richard called, making her stop. What you said in the interview, about meeting people who make us see the world differently, do you really believe that? She turned to face him again. Yes, I do. Don't you? Richard didn't respond immediately, but his gaze said much. When Helen finally left the room, he remained there thoughtful. The bet he had made was beginning to seem increasingly less important in light of what he was discovering about Helen and about himself. The weeks passed in a flurry of activities. Helen dove headfirst into her training, surprising everyone with her adaptability and quick learning. Her mornings were filled with etiquette and social behavior classes, while her afternoons were dedicated to developing the social project she so desired to implement. It was during one of those afternoons, while Helen was working on her laptop, in the spacious library of the penthouse that Richard entered, looking concerned. "We have a problem," he announced, sitting in the armchair across from her. Helen closed the laptop, giving him her full attention. "What happened?" "Valentina," Richard sighed, "she's spreading rumors about you in the press." Helen felt a knot in her stomach. Although she knew Richard's ex-fiancée existed, until then she hadn't represented a real threat. "What kind of rumors?" "She's insinuating that you're a gold digger," Richard explained, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Says she has proof that our relationship is a farce." "Well," Helen hesitated, "technically, she's not wrong, is she?" Richard stared at her, surprised by her frankness. "It's not that simple. What started as an agreement, well, things have changed." Helen's heart raced at these words, but she forced herself to stay focused. "What can we do?" "For now, nothing," Richard replied. "We'll keep on course, but we need to be prepared. The press will want answers, and we need to be convincing." That night, during a charity dinner, Helen faced her first major public challenge. Dressed in an elegant emerald green dress, she walked alongside Richard when they were approached by a group of socialites. "So this is the famous Helen," said a blonde woman, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We were curious to meet you." "It's a pleasure to meet you all," replied Helen, maintaining the composure Victoria had taught her. "Tell us, dear," the woman continued, "is it true that you come from humble origins?" Helen felt Richard tense beside her, but before he could intervene, she responded, "I come from a different reality than yours, yes, and that's exactly why. I'm so committed to creating bridges between different worlds through our social project." Her response caught the group by surprise. Another woman, older, leaned in with interest. "What project is that?" Helen seized the opportunity to talk about her initiative for professional training for people in vulnerable situations. Her passion and eloquence captivated not only the initial group, but also other guests who approached to listen. By the end of the night, several business people had shown interest in supporting the project. Richard observed everything with a mixture of pride and admiration. "You were incredible," he said as they returned home. "You transformed an attack into an opportunity." Helen smiled, tired but satisfied. "I learned from the best." In the days that followed, Helen continued to surprise everyone with her social navigation abilities. She not only quickly learned the rules of etiquette and behavior, but also applied them naturally and authentically. However, not everything was rosy. Valentina's attacks in the press intensified, and soon photos of Helen in her previous life appeared, sitting on park benches or walking the city streets. "This is a nightmare," lamented Victoria, throwing magazines on the table during an emergency meeting. "How are we going to explain this?" It was Helen who responded, her voice calm and determined. "We won't explain, we'll embrace it." Everyone in the room looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" asked Richard. "Let's use my story as inspiration," explained Helen. "Show that transformation and second chances are possible. We can use this to boost our social project." The idea was bold but brilliant. In the days that followed, Helen gave a series of carefully orchestrated interviews in which she spoke openly about her past experiences and how they shaped her worldview and desire to make a difference. The public responded with enthusiasm. Helen's story of overcoming and purpose touched hearts and inspired thousands. Donations for the social project skyrocketed, and soon she found herself at the center of a movement much larger than she had ever imagined. However, with increased exposure came new challenges. Helen began receiving messages from old acquaintances from her life on the streets, some asking for help, others accusing her of having sold her soul by joining the elite. One night, exhausted, after a long day of commitments, Helen found Richard on the penthouse balcony, looking out at the illuminated city. "How do you handle all this?" she asked, joining him. "The constant pressure, the gazes, the expectations." Richard looked at her for a long time before answering. "You get used to it with time, but it never really gets easy." "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice," confessed Helen. "If I'm not betraying who I was." Richard turned to her, his eyes intense. "Helen, you haven't betrayed anyone. You're using your position to do something meaningful. That's more than most people in this world do." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Actually, you've inspired me to rethink many things in my life and how I conduct my business." Helen felt her heart race with the proximity and intensity of the moment. "Richard, But before she could finish, they were interrupted by Mark, Richard's assistant. "Sir, we have a situation," he said, looking concerned. "Valentina is live on a TV show making serious accusations against both of you." Richard and Helen exchanged a look. The challenge they faced was far from over, but somehow Helen knew that together they could overcome any obstacle. As they followed Mark inside, Helen reflected on how drastically her life had changed in such a short time. What had begun as a bizarre agreement had transformed into a journey of self-discovery and purpose. And although the future was uncertain, she was determined to face it head-on, with Richard by her side. The television studio was deathly silent when Richard and Helen entered. They had arrived in time to see the last minutes of Valentina's interview on the country's most watched live program. "And I have proof," Valentina was saying, her face impeccably made up for the cameras, "that this marriage is nothing but a farce, an elaborate marketing ploy by Richard Martin to save his image after our breakup." The host, a middle-aged man known for his aggressive approach, leaned forward. "And what proof would that be, Valentina?" With a triumphant smile, Valentina pulled an envelope from her designer handbag. Internal documents from Martin Fashion Group detailing the plan, including a budget for the transformation of this key. Helen. The shock was palpable in the studio. Richard felt Helen tense beside him, but before he could say anything, she stepped forward. "Can we go live?" Helen asked one of the producers, who nodded, surprised by her presence. Seconds later, the host announced, "We have an incredible twist, ladies and gentlemen. Helen and Richard Martin are here in the studio to respond to the accusations." The cameras turned to the couple. Valentina, caught by surprise, visibly paled. Helen was the first to speak, her voice calm and firm. "Good evening, America. Yes, it's true that my meeting with Richard was not conventional. And yes, there was an initial plan." A murmur ran through the studio, but Helen continued. "But what began as an agreement transformed into something much deeper and more meaningful, not just for the two of us, but for thousands of people who are benefiting from our social project." Richard, amazed by Helen's composure, took the floor. "What Valentina doesn't mention is that these documents, if they are real, were obtained illegally, and more importantly, they don't tell the whole story." The host, sensing the potential of the situation, asked, "And what would the complete story be, Richard?" It was Helen who answered, "The story of two people from completely different worlds who met and saw an opportunity not just for personal growth, but to make a real difference in the world." She then turned directly to Valentina. "You may have documents, Valentina, but we have real results, lives that are being transformed, people who are receiving a second chance." The studio fell silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of Helen's words. Then slowly a wave of applause began, growing until it became an ovation. Valentina, realizing she had lost control of the narrative, tried one last card. But you admit that it all started as a farce." Richard stepped forward, his voice firm. "What began as an agreement transformed into true love. And if there's a lesson we've learned on this journey, it's that people can change, grow, and overcome their past mistakes." Social media exploded. In a matter of minutes, the hashtag #HelenandRichardReal was trending. The public, captivated by the honesty and redemption narrative, embraced the couple. In the days that followed, Helen and Richard's story dominated the headlines, but in a way neither could have predicted. Instead of scandal, the focus was on personal transformation and the social impact of their project. A week after the bombshell interview, Helen and Richard were in a disadvantaged community in Boston, inaugurating the first professional training center of their project. "I never imagined we would be here," said Helen, observing the line of people eager to enroll in the courses. Richard embraced her waist, a gesture that now seemed natural and comfortable. "You changed everything, Helen. Not just my life, but how I see the world and business." At that moment, an elderly lady approached the couple, tears in her eyes. "My granddaughter will be able to study thanks to you," she said, holding Helen's hands. "Thank you for not forgetting where you came from." Helen felt her own eyes fill with tears. "I will never forget," she promised. That night, back at the penthouse, Helen found Richard on the balcony, their favorite place for reflection. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, joining him. Richard looked at her, his eyes full of an emotion she had never seen before. "I'm thinking about how a foolish bet almost ruined my life, and how ironically it brought me what I needed most." "And what would that be?" asked Helen, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "You," he replied simply, "your strength, your compassion, your worldview. Helen, He hesitated, searching for the right words. Helen waited, her heart beating rapidly. "I love you," Richard finally said. "Not as part of an agreement, not as a marketing move. I love you truly with all that I am." Helen smiled, tears of happiness in her eyes. "I love you too, Richard. And I'm grateful for every moment of this crazy journey that brought us here." As they kissed, with the city lights shining in the background, both knew that what they had, found in each other, was far more valuable than any bet or agreement. It was true love, born from the most unlikely circumstances, but destined to last a lifetime. And so what began as an elaborate plan to avenge a betrayal transformed into a story of love, redemption, and social impact. Helen and Richard had not only found each other, but also a greater purpose for their lives. The future still held many challenges, but now they knew that together they could face anything. The transformation was just beginning, not only for them, but for all the lives they would touch through their love and their work. With the success of the live interview and growing public support, Helen and Richard found themselves at the center of a media storm that showed no signs of diminishing. What was once a story of scandal and speculation had transformed into an inspiring tale of love and social redemption. However, with the growing exposure came new challenges that the couple hadn't foreseen. One morning, while having coffee on the penthouse balcony, Mark, Richard's assistant, hurriedly entered. "Sir, ma'am," he said, visibly disturbed. "We have a situation." Richard frowned. "What happened, Mark?" "A group of people. They're camped at the building entrance. They say they know Helen from before." Helen felt her blood freeze. She knew this day would come, but hadn't expected it so soon. "They're my former street companions," she said, her voice low. "They probably saw the news and want help." Richard looked at her with concern. "What do you want to do?" Helen took a deep breath. "I need to talk to them. These are people who went through hardships with me. I can't simply ignore them." Descending to the building lobby, Helen and Richard encountered a group of about 10 people, familiar faces to Helen, marked by time and the difficulties of life on the streets. "Helen!" shouted a middle-aged woman standing out from the group. "Do you remember me? It's me, Donna Carter." Helen felt a lump in her throat. Donna had been almost a mother to her during her most difficult days. "Of course I remember, Donna Carter. How could I forget?" The group approached, and Helen noticed the suspicious looks they cast at Richard and the building security guards. "We came to ask for your help, Helen," said a younger man, whom she recognized as Peter. "You managed to get out of this life. You can help us too, can't you?" Helen felt the weight of responsibility falling on her shoulders. She looked at Richard, who nodded in silent support. "I want to help all of you," she began, her voice firm but gentle. "But I can't simply give money or a place to live. What I can offer is a chance, an opportunity to change your life as I had." She then explained about the social project they had started, about the training centers and employment opportunities they were creating. Some in the group seemed excited about the idea, but others showed skepticism. "And in the meantime," asked Donna Carter, "where will we sleep? What will we eat?" It was Richard who stepped forward this time. "I have a proposal," he said. "We can provide temporary accommodations and food for you while you participate in the training programs, but it's a mutual commitment. You'll have to dedicate yourselves to the courses and actively seek a new life." The group discussed among themselves for a few moments. Finally, Peter spoke. "We accept. It's more than anyone has ever done for us." In the days that followed, Helen and Richard worked tirelessly to accommodate the group and integrate them into the social programs. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, moments of frustration, and even some relapses. But gradually, positive results began to appear. Peter discovered a talent for graphic design and was soon interning at an agency. Donna Carter, with her life experience, became a valuable counselor for other program participants. However, not everything was rosy. The press, always eager for sensationalist stories, began to speculate about Helen's past. Headlines appeared questioning whether she had really lived on the streets or if it was all an elaborate marketing story. One night, after a particularly difficult day dealing with the press and managing crises, Helen found Richard in his office, looking exhausted. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing," she said, sitting heavily in an armchair. Richard looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean, exposing everything this way? Maybe we should have kept things more private, focused just on the social work without all this media attention." Richard stood up and knelt before her, holding her hands. "Helen, look at me. What we're doing is bigger than both of us. Yes, there are challenges, there are criticisms, there are difficult days. But think of all the lives we're impacting. Think of Peter, of Donna Carter, of all the others who are getting a second chance." Helen felt tears in her eyes. "You're right. It's just that. Sometimes the pressure seems overwhelming." "I know," said Richard, embracing her, "but we're in this together, and together we can overcome anything." At that moment, as if to prove Richard's point, the phone rang. It was Mark. "Sir," he said, his voice excited, "we just received the news. The bill we were supporting for tax incentives to companies that hire people in vulnerable situations has been approved." Helen and Richard looked at each other, a smile spreading across their faces. It was a significant victory that could multiply the impact of their work on a national scale. "See," said Richard, gently kissing Helen. "For each challenge, we have a victory. And this victory, this is thanks to you, to your story, to your courage to expose yourself and fight for what you believe in." Helen felt a wave of renewed determination. Yes, the path was difficult. Yes, there were days when the pressure seemed unbearable, but the impact they were having, the lives they were changing, made it all worthwhile. As they prepared to make a public announcement about the new law, Helen reflected on how her life had changed. From a hopeless young woman living on the streets, she had become a powerful voice for social change. And by her side, she had a man who not only loved her, but shared her vision of a better world. The price of fame was high, but the benefits they could bring to others were incalculable. And with that thought, Helen prepared to face another day, knowing that each challenge overcome was a step toward a better future for all. The big day was rapidly approaching. There were only 2 weeks left until Helen and Richard's wedding, and the anticipation was palpable not just for the couple, but for the entire country. What had begun as a bizarre agreement had transformed into a love story that captured the public's imagination. On that sunny Saturday morning, Helen found herself in the most prestigious haute couture atelier in Boston. It was the day of the final fitting for her wedding dress, a unique creation that combined the luxury expected of a high-profile wedding with elements that reflected her journey and values. "It's perfect," whispered Victoria, watching Helen slowly turn in front of the mirror. The dress was a masterpiece. The base was pure silk with an elegant cut that accentuated Helen's silhouette. But what really made it special were the details. Intricate embroidery done by artisans from disadvantaged communities, representing city scenes and symbols of hope and transformation. "It's more than I could have dreamed," said Helen, emotional. Atai. That moment, the atelier door opened and Donna Carter entered, her eyes widening at the sight of Helen. "Oh, my girl," she exclaimed, tears in her eyes. You look... Helen rushed to embrace the older woman, taking care not to wrinkle the dress. "Donna, I'm so glad you came." Donna Carter's presence at the dress fitting was no accident. In recent months, she had become an important figure in Helen and Richard's social project, using her life experience to guide other participants. "I never imagined I'd see you like this," said Donna, holding Helen's hands. "I remember you, a frightened girl on the streets, and now, look at you." Helen felt a lump in her throat. "And that's why this dress is so special, Donna. It tells our story, the story of all the people we're helping." Victoria, who was observing the scene with interest, intervened. "Helen, we have a surprise for you." She gestured, and a young woman entered the atelier carrying a box. Helen recognized her immediately. It was Maria, one of the first participants in the training program. "Maria, what are you doing here?" The young woman smiled shyly. I made this for you," she said, opening the box. Inside was a delicate veil, all hand-embroidered with small flowers and birds. "It's beautiful," exclaimed Helen, touching the soft fabric. "All of us in the artisan program worked on it," explained Maria. "We wanted to give you something special, to thank you for everything you and Mr. Richard have done for us." Helen felt tears running down her face. Carefully, she put on the veil, completing the look. "Now," said Victoria, "the bride is ready." At that moment, looking at herself in the mirror, Helen saw more than a bride. She saw a warrior, a survivor, a woman who had transformed her own life and was now helping others do the same. But the happiness of the moment was briefly interrupted when Victoria's cell phone rang. After a brief conversation, she turned to Helen with a worried expression. "We have a problem," she said. "The press found out about the dress fitting. There's a crowd of reporters and photographers outside." Helen took a deep breath. She knew moments like this would come, that her life was now under constant public scrutiny. "What do you want to do?" asked Victoria. "We can try to leave through the back." But Helen was already shaking her head. "No, we won't hide." She looked at Donna and Maria, then back at Victoria. "Let's face this head on, but not alone. I want Donna and Maria to come with me." Victoria seemed hesitant. "Are you sure?" "The press can be ruthless." "No, I'm sure," Helen replied firmly. "This is my story, our story, and we'll tell it our way." Minutes later, the atelier doors opened. Helen emerged, radiant in her wedding dress, flanked by Donna and Maria. Camera flashes exploded and reporters shouted questions. Helen raised her hand, asking for silence, and to her surprise, the crowd quieted down. "This dress," she began, her voice clear and firm, "is not just about a wedding. It's about transformation, about second chances, about the beauty that can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances." She then introduced Donna and Maria, briefly telling their stories and how they were connected to the social project. "True luxury," Helen concluded, "isn't in expensive fabrics or jewels. It's in the ability to make a difference in others' lives. And that's what Richard and I are committed to doing, not just in our marriage, but every day of our lives." Helen's words, her posture, and the presence of Donna and Maria created a powerful image. The reporters, who came in search of gossip and scandals, found themselves facing a story of hope and social transformation. Later, back at the penthouse, Helen found Richard waiting for her. "You look beautiful," he said, embracing her carefully to avoid wrinkling the dress. "And what you did out there, it was incredible." Helen smiled, tired but happy. "I just told the truth, our truth." Richard kissed her softly. 2 weeks, he murmured. "In 2 weeks, it will be official." "It's already official in my heart," replied Helen. "The rest is just formality." As they prepared for another night of planning, both for the wedding and for the expansion of their social projects, Helen reflected on her journey. From a hopeless young woman on the streets to a bride about to be married and make a difference in the world. It was a transformation that not even the most talented fairy tale writer could have imagined. But the real story, she knew, was just beginning. The wedding wouldn't be the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter of love, purpose, and social impact. And Helen could hardly wait to turn the page. The eve of the wedding arrived faster than Helen and Richard could imagine. The buzz in the city was palpable, with the media in an uproar and the couple's fans anxious for the big day. However, for the bride and groom, the night before the wedding would be dedicated to something much more significant than rehearsals or traditional pre-wedding parties. Helen adjusted the simple necklace she wore as she observed the packed hall. The venue, a renovated old industrial warehouse, was filled with people from all social classes. It was the official inauguration of the largest professional training center of the couple's social project, strategically scheduled for the eve of the wedding. "Nervous?" asked Richard, approaching from behind and placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Helen smiled, turning to face him. "A little, but it's a good nervousness. I'm eager to see the results of this project." The event began with emotional speeches from some of the program's beneficiaries. Peter, who was now a promising graphic designer, spoke about how the project changed his life. Donna Carter shared her experience as a mentor for younger participants. Each story was a powerful testament to the impact Helen and Richard were having. When it was Helen's turn to speak, she took the stage to warm applause. Dressed simply but elegantly, she emanated a confidence few could imagine in someone who, not long ago, lived on the streets. "A year ago," she began, her voice firm, "I didn't know what the future held for me. Today I stand before you not just as a bride, but as a partner in a greater dream. This center is not just a building. It's a symbol of hope, of second chances, of transformation." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Tomorrow, Richard and I will marry. But the real commitment we make is not just to each other, but to each of you, to this community, to this dream of a more just and equal world." Helen's words were met with a standing ovation. Richard, watching from the side of the stage, felt his heart fill with pride and love. This was the true legacy they were building together. After the speeches, as guests circulated through the space, meeting the facilities and talking with instructors, Helen was approached by an unexpected figure, Edward Villiers, Richard's rival who had proposed the original bet. "Ms. Helen," he said, his voice carrying a tone of respect that surprised everyone around, I would like to congratulate you, not just on the wedding, but for all this." He gestured to the center around them. "You proved that I was wrong. Terribly wrong." Helen observed him for a moment, pondering her response. "Mr. Villiers, thank you, but this isn't about proving someone right or wrong. It's about making a difference, and there's room for everyone in that mission." Villiers seemed genuinely touched by her words. "You're right, and well, I'd like to contribute, if you'll allow me, of course." At that moment, Richard joined them, placing a protective arm around Helen's waist. "Edward," he said with a nod. "Richard," Villiers responded. "I was telling your fiancé that I'd like to contribute to the project. Perhaps we can bury our differences and work together for something greater." Richard exchanged a look with Helen, who nodded subtly. "I think we can arrange that," he said, extending his hand for a shake. As the two men discussed possible collaborations, Helen moved away for a moment of quiet. She found a tranquil corner of the hall and took a deep breath, letting the reality of everything that had happened in recent months sink in. "A penny for your thoughts," said a soft voice behind her. It was Victoria. Helen smiled at her mentor, and now friend. "Just absorbing all this. Sometimes it feels like a dream." Victoria placed a comforting hand on Helen's shoulder. "It's not a dream, dear. It's the result of your hard work, your compassion, and your vision. You deserve every moment of this." The two women stood in silence for a moment, observing the animated crowd. "You know," Helen finally said, "when all this started, I thought I was just playing a role, pretending to be someone I wasn't. But now I realize this was always me. I just needed the right opportunity to flourish." Victoria smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "And that's why you're so special, Helen. You didn't just transform yourself, but you're transforming others. This is just the beginning." When the night came to an end, Helen and Richard were preparing to leave. Traditionally, the bride and groom would spend the night before the wedding apart, but they had decided to break that rule. "Ready to go?" asked Richard, offering his arm. Helen took it, smiling. more than ever. As they walked to the car, surrounded by camera flashes and shouts of support from the crowd that had gathered outside, Helen reflected on the journey that had brought them there. From an impulsive bet to true love, from a marketing plan to a social transformation movement. Tomorrow would be the wedding day, an event the entire country was waiting for. But for Helen and Richard, the real celebration was already happening. It was the celebration of transformed lives, of realized dreams, of a future full of possibilities. As the car drove away, taking them back home, Helen rested her head on Richard's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, interlacing his fingers with hers. "For giving me the chance to be who I was always meant to be." Richard gently kissed her forehead. "No, my love, thank you for showing me the man I could be." And so on the eve of their wedding, Helen and Richard weren't just preparing for a ceremony, they were preparing for the next chapter of a journey that promised to change not just their lives but the lives of countless others. The true fairy tale, they had learned, wasn't about castles and crowns, but about open hearts and hands extended to help. The dawn of the wedding day brought with it an electric atmosphere that seemed to envelop the entire city of Boston. The streets near Trinity Church, where the ceremony would take place, were already packed with fans and onlookers since the early morning hours. Helen and Richard's wedding had become much more than a social event. It was a symbol of hope and transformation for millions of Americans. In the luxurious hotel where Helen was getting ready, the bride's room was a whirlwind of activity. Stylists, makeup artists, and hairdressers worked in harmony to create the perfect look. But at the center of all this commotion, Helen remained surprisingly calm. "You look radiant," said Donna Carter, who had been invited to be one of the bridesmaids. The lady, now elegantly dressed, hardly resembled the woman Helen had known on the streets. Helen smiled, holding the hands of her former mentor. "It's thanks to people like you, Donna. You gave me strength when I needed it most." At that moment, Victoria entered the room, carrying a small box. "Helen, dear, I have something for you." Inside the box was a delicate pearl necklace. "It was my grandmother's," explained Victoria. "She always said that pearls are symbols of wisdom acquired through adversity. I thought it would be perfect for you." With tears in her eyes, Helen embraced Victoria. "Thank you for everything." Across town, in the penthouse that would soon be the couple's home, Richard was preparing with the help of Mark and some close friends. Despite his usual composure, the businessman couldn't completely hide his nervousness. "What if I forget the vows?" he murmured, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Mark laughed, placing a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "Richard, you face boards of directors and multi-million-dollar negotiations without blinking. I'm sure you can remember a few words of love." Richard smiled, grateful for his friend's presence. "It's different, Mark. This is real. It's for life. And that's why it will be perfect," Mark assured him. At 11 a.m. sharp, the doors of Trinity Church opened. The interior of the church was decorated with an elegant mixture of white flowers and artisanal elements created by participants in the couple's social project. Each detail told a story of transformation and hope. When the wedding march began to play, all those present stood up. Richard, standing at the altar, felt his heart race. And then he saw her. Helen walked down the aisle, a vision of beauty and grace in her unique dress. But what really captured everyone's attention wasn't just her physical appearance, but the aura of confidence and purpose that emanated from her. At her side walked Peter, the young man she had met on the streets and who now led her to the altar. It was a symbolic gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone. Helen wasn't just marrying Richard, but uniting two worlds that previously seemed irreconcilable. When Helen reached the altar, Richard took her hands in his eyes shining with emotion. "You are absolutely stunning," he whispered. The minister began the ceremony with words that echoed through the church. "We are here today not just to celebrate the union of two people, but to witness the transformative power of love, not just between two individuals, but love for humanity. The time came for the vows. Richard went first. Helen, when we met, I thought I knew everything about the world, about business, about success. But you showed me that I knew nothing about what really matters. You taught me the value of compassion, humility, and true purpose. I promise to spend the rest of my life not just loving you, but working by your side to make this world a better place. Helen, with tears in her eyes, began her vows. Richard, you offered me a chance when I thought all doors were closed, but what you really gave me was much more than an opportunity. You gave me a purpose. Together we discovered that true love isn't about castles in the air or fairy tales, but about building bridges and tearing down walls. I promise to be your partner, your confidant and your companion in all the battles we face, always with the goal of spreading more light in this world. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when the minister finally pronounced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The kiss that sealed the union was received with a deafening ovation, not just inside the church, but also from the thousands of people gathered outside, watching on large screens. As the couple walked back down the aisle, now as husband and wife, confetti made from recycled paper, another project from their social initiative, rained down on them. Outside the church, a crowd awaited them. Helen and Richard stopped at the top of the steps, waving to the mass of people. At that moment, they weren't just a newly married couple, but a symbol of hope for millions. Ready for the next adventure? Richard whispered in Helen's ear. She smiled, squeezing his hand. Always, my love, always. And so, under the applause and cheers of the crowd, Helen and Richard entered their decorated car, ready to begin not just their life as a couple, but a new era of social change and hope for all those whose lives they touched. Helen and Richard's wedding wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of many others. It was the start of a new chapter, not just for them, but for all those who believed in the power of transformation and true love. The private jet took off smoothly from Boston Logan International Airport, carrying Helen and Richard to their honeymoon. But this wouldn't be a conventional newlywed trip. The couple had decided to combine their celebration of love with a greater mission. I still can't believe we're doing this, said Helen, looking out the window as Boston disappeared beneath the clouds. Richard smiled, interlacing his fingers with hers. Well, we were never a conventional couple, were we? The plan was audacious, a 3-week trip through Latin America, combining romantic moments with visits to social projects and disadvantaged communities. The idea was not only to expand the reach of their initiatives, but also to inspire other business people and public figures to engage in social causes. Their first stop was in a small town in rural Colombia, known for its high unemployment rate. Among young people, Helen and Richard were received with enthusiasm by the local community. It's amazing to see how our story reached here, commented Helen, observing the welcome posters with their faces printed on them. In the days that followed, the couple worked tirelessly. During the day, they participated in meetings with community leaders, visited schools and training centers, and shared their experiences. At night, they found time for intimate moments, rediscovering each other away from the spotlights of Boston. One afternoon, while walking through a slum on the outskirts of Bogota, Helen stopped. Abruptly, Richard followed her gaze and saw a young mother struggling to carry shopping bags while holding a baby. Without hesitation, Helen approached to help. The young woman, initially suspicious, soon opened up upon perceiving Helen's genuine compassion. "What's your name?" Helen asked in Spanish. "Maria," the young woman replied timidly. In the minutes that followed, Helen heard Maria's story, a story of struggle, resilience, and hope that echoed so many others she had known in Boston. That night, in the hotel room, Helen was pensive. "What are you thinking about?" asked Richard, gently massaging her shoulders. "About Maria," Helen replied, "and about all the Marias we've met. Richard, we can do more. We need to do more." And thus was born the idea of Project Bridges, an initiative to connect disadvantaged communities in different countries, sharing resources, knowledge, and opportunities. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. In each country they visited, Peru, Chile, Argentina. The couple not only established contacts for Project Bridges, but also inspired local changes. In Lima, they convinced a group of business people to invest in a microcredit program for women entrepreneurs. In Santiago, they laid the groundwork for a cultural exchange between young artists from disadvantaged communities. In Buenos Aires, they initiated a partnership with universities to offer scholarships to low-income students. But not everything was rosy. The constant exposure and hard work began to take their toll. One night in a hotel in Montevideo, Helen broke down in tears. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough," she sobbed in Richard's arms. "There's so much need, so much pain." Richard held her tight, gently kissing her forehead. "My love, look at all we've accomplished. Each life we touch is a victory. We can't save the world alone, but we can inspire others to join us." Those words seemed to renew Helen's energy. In the days that followed, she approached each challenge with renewed vigor. The last stop of the trip was in Rio de Janeiro. The couple decided to end their honeymoon with a large charity event, bringing together business people, artists, and community leaders from all over Latin America. On the stage of the event, Helen and Richard shared their experiences from the past weeks. They talked about Maria in Colombia, about the young artists in Chile, about the women entrepreneurs in Peru. Each story was a testimony to the power of compassion and action. "We're not here to ask you to do exactly what we did," Helen concluded, her voice laden with emotion. "We're here to show that it's possible to make a difference, no matter who you are or where you come from. Each of us has the power to be a bridge between worlds, to create opportunities where before there was only hopelessness." The speech was received with a standing ovation. In the days that followed, social media exploded with the hashtag #InChakBeBridge, inspiring solidarity actions across the continent. On the night before returning to Boston, Helen and Richard were on the balcony of their hotel, observing the lights of the marvelous city. "So you know," said Richard, embracing Helen from behind, "when I proposed that crazy bet months ago, I could never have imagined where it would lead us." Helen turned in his arms, looking deeply into his eyes. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? Who would have thought that an arrogant billionaire and a street girl would become the faces of a social revolution?" Richard laughed, kissing her softly. "And our story is far from over, my love. In fact, I feel like we're just beginning." As the couple prepared to return to Boston, they knew they were coming back not just as newlyweds, but as leaders of a movement that promised to transform lives throughout Latin America. Their honeymoon had been much more than a celebration of their love. It had been the birth of a legacy that would continue to grow and inspire for many years. The return of Helen and Richard to Boston was marked by a warm reception. Fans, journalists, and supporters of the couple's social project filled the airport concourse, eager to welcome the ambassadors of hope, as the media had dubbed them. As they moved through the crowd, waving and occasionally stopping for quick selfies, Helen noticed something different in the air. It wasn't just the usual admiration, but a palpable energy of expectation and anticipation. "They're expecting something from us," she whispered to Richard. He nodded, gently squeezing her hand. "And we won't disappoint them." The days that followed were a rush of meetings, interviews, and strategic planning. Project Bridges, born during the honeymoon, needed to be structured and implemented on a large scale. One afternoon, while working in their joint office in the penthouse, Helen received a call that would change everything. "Hello?" she answered, frowning as she heard the agitated voice on the other end. "Calm down, Peter, take a deep breath and tell me what happened." Richard observed his wife's expression change from concern to shock. "We're on our way," said Helen, hanging up the phone and rising abruptly. "We have an emergency." On the way to the training center, Helen explained the situation. A fire had hit a nearby community, leaving dozens of families homeless. Many of them were participants in the couple's social programs. Arriving at the scene, the devastation was evident. Entire families were on the streets with lost and desperate looks. Helen and Richard exchanged a determined look before diving into action. The following hours were a whirlwind. The couple mobilized all available resources. Temporary shelters were set up, food and clothing were distributed, and a medical team was called to attend to the injured. "We need to do more," said Helen. observing a child crying in its mother's arms. This can't just be a temporary solution. It was then that Richard had a bold idea. What if we transformed this tragedy into an opportunity? In the days that followed, the couple launched Project Phoenix, an ambitious initiative to not only rebuild the lost homes, but to create a model community of sustainability and opportunities. The project attracted national and international attention. Renowned architects offered to design the new homes, technology companies donated equipment for a digital inclusion center, and volunteers from across the country signed up to help. However, not everything ran smoothly. Government bureaucracy, conflicting political interests, and even critics who accused the couple of self-promotion threatened to delay the project. One night, exhausted after a long day of negotiations, with local authorities, Helen and Richard found themselves on the balcony of their penthouse, a habit they had developed for moments of reflection. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing," confessed Helen, her voice laden with doubt. "What if we're meddling where we shouldn't?" Richard embraced her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Remember what you once told me? That sometimes we need to accept crazy proposals to make the difference we've always dreamed of." Helen smiled, remembering that fateful day when she accepted Richard's proposal. "It seems like a lifetime ago. And look at us now," he continued. "Maybe Project Phoenix is our craziest proposal yet, but if there's anyone who can turn this into reality, it's us." Renewed by this conversation, the couple dove headfirst into the project. Helen led an awareness campaign on social media, while Richard used his contacts in the business world to secure more support and resources. Weeks passed, and slowly, Project Phoenix began to take shape. The first houses were built, the community center was almost ready, and professional training programs were already underway. One day, while overseeing the progress of the construction, Helen and Richard were approached by an elderly lady, one of the residents affected by the fire. "You two," she said, holding the couple's hands, "are angels sent to save us." Helen felt tears in her eyes. "No, ma'am, we're not angels. We're just people who believe everyone deserves a chance to start over." The lady smiled, her eyes shining with hope. "And that's what makes you special. You didn't just give us a roof, but you gave us back our dignity." Those words echoed deeply in Helen and Richard. They realized their work went far beyond social projects or charity initiatives. It was about restoring people's faith in themselves and in a better future. As Project Phoenix progressed, it became clear that Helen and Richard had created something truly revolutionary. It wasn't just a rebuilt community, but a model of how collaboration between different sectors of society could create lasting change. Journalists from around the world came to cover the story. Politicians began to use the project as an example in their speeches. But for Helen and Richard, the real success was in the smiles of the families who finally had a place to call home. One night, as they walked hand in hand through the streets of the new community, watching children playing and neighbors chatting animatedly, Helen suddenly stopped. "What is it?" asked Richard, noticing his wife's thoughtful expression. "I was just thinking," she replied, a smile forming on her lips. "When we met, you wanted to prove you could transform anyone into a society lady. But in the end, it was we who were transformed." Richard pulled her close, kissing her softly. "And that transformation is far from over, my love. We have a whole world to change." As the couple continued their walk, reflecting on the path that had brought them there and dreaming of the future that was yet to come, one thing was clear. The true fairy tale wasn't about castles or riches, but about the power of love and compassion too. Transform lives and entire communities. The months following the inauguration of Project Phoenix were a whirlwind of activities for Helen and Richard. The success of the initiative had catapulted the couple to a new level of international recognition. Invitations for speeches, television programs, and even meetings with heads of state became routine. On a sunny Thursday morning, Helen woke up feeling strangely nauseous. Initially, she attributed the discomfort to dinner the night before with foreign investors. However, when the symptom persisted for days, a suspicion began to form in her mind. "Richard," she called, as her husband was preparing to leave for a meeting. I think we need to talk." The serious expression on Helen's face made Richard sit immediately at her side on the bed. "What is it, my love? Something wrong?" Helen took a deep breath, a mix of anxiety and excitement in her voice. I think I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Richard's briefcase falling to the floor. His eyes widened, a mixture of shock and joy spreading across his face. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Not yet," Helen replied, "but all the signs are there. I made an appointment with the doctor for this afternoon." The hours that followed were an emotional roller coaster for the couple. As they waited for the test results, their minds raced with possibilities and concerns. "What if it's true?" asked Helen, as they walked hand in hand through the park near the clinic. "How will this affect our work, our projects?" Richard gently squeezed her hand. "It will just be one more reason to continue fighting for a better world. Imagine raising our child in a world transformed by our actions." The confirmation came late in the afternoon. Helen was indeed pregnant, about 8 weeks along. The news, though expected, still caught them by surprise. In the days that followed, the couple intensely debated how and when to announce the pregnancy. They knew the news would be received with great public interest and wanted to ensure it wouldn't overshadow the important work they were doing. It was during a visit to Project Phoenix that Helen had an epiphany. Watching children playing in the new community playground, she turned to Richard with a gleam in her eyes. "What if we used this as an opportunity?" she asked. "Not just to announce our pregnancy, but to launch a new initiative focused on maternal and child health in disadvantaged communities." The idea quickly took shape. In the following weeks, while keeping the pregnancy a secret, Helen and Richard worked tirelessly on the details of what would come to be called Project First Steps. The official announcement was made during a press conference at the Project Phoenix Community Center. Helen, radiant in a dress that subtly highlighted her still small belly, spoke passionately about the challenges faced by mothers in vulnerable communities. "Our personal journey has made us realize even more the importance of ensuring that every child has a healthy and promising start in life," she declared. Project First Steps aims to provide prenatal care, postpartum support, and early childhood education for families who need it most. The response was overwhelming. Partnership offers and donations began to arrive from all corners. Celebrities offered to be ambassadors for the cause. Within days, Project First Steps became one of the most discussed topics on social media. However, not everything was rosy. With increasing exposure came criticisms. Some accused the couple of using the pregnancy as a marketing move. Others questioned whether they would be able to balance family life with their social commitments. One night, after a long day of interviews and meetings, Helen found Richard on the penthouse balcony, their usual refuge. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing," she confessed, gently caressing her belly. "Exposing our personal life this way." Richard embraced her in his arms, softly kissing her forehead. "Remember what we always say. Our life is our message. By sharing our journey, we inspire others to do the same." Helen smiled, leaning against him. "You're right. It's just that. Sometimes I feel the weight of all these expectations, not just as a public figure, but now as a future mother. And you'll be amazing in both roles," Richard assured her, "just as you've been in everything you do." In the months that followed, Helen's belly grew along with the reach of Project First Steps. Mobile clinics began to circulate through disadvantaged communities, offering free prenatal checkups. Early childhood support centers were inaugurated in several cities. Helen, even with her advanced pregnancy, remained tireless in her work. She made a point of personally visiting the projects, talking with mothers and children, listening to their stories and needs. It was during one of these visits, already in her 8th month of pregnancy, that Helen had a moment of revelation. While talking with a young mother who had benefited from the project, she felt a strong kick from the baby. "He or she is excited today," commented Helen, laughing and placing her hand on her belly. The young mother smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Your baby is already making a difference in the world, just like you." Those words touched Helen deeply. She realized that her journey, from street girl to recognized philanthropist and now future mother, was a living testimony to the power of transformation and second chances. That night, back at the penthouse, Helen shared her thoughts with Richard. "You know," she said, nestled in her husband's arms as they watched the sunset over Boston, "when I accepted your crazy proposal more than a year ago, I never imagined I'd end up here. But now, looking back, I see that each step brought us exactly where we were meant to be." Richard gently kissed her temple. "And this is just the beginning, my love. We have a lifetime ahead to continue making a difference, together." As night fell over the city, Helen and Richard dreamed of the future, not just theirs, but that of all the lives they would continue to touch. The baby growing inside, Helen was more than just their child. It was a symbol of hope and renewal for all who knew their story. And so, as they prepared for the next chapter of their lives, Helen and Richard knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. An adventure of love, purpose, and the eternal quest for a better world. The day when Helen and Richard's son came into the world was marked by a peculiar mix of privacy and public expectation. The couple had decided on a humanized birth in a special wing of the hospital, away from the curious eyes of the media. However, outside, a crowd gathered, eager for news. The first contractions began during a board meeting of Project First Steps. Helen, always dedicated, insisted on concluding the agenda before allowing Richard to take her to the hospital. "Our son is already showing he has your timing," Richard joked as he helped Helen into the car. The hours that followed were intense. Helen, who had faced so many challenges in her life, now faced what many consider the most transformative experience of all: giving birth. "You can do it, my love," Richard encouraged, firmly holding Helen's hand. "You're the strongest woman I know." With one last effort and a cry that seemed to contain all the strength of her journey, Helen brought into the world a healthy boy with powerful lungs. "It's a boy," announced the midwife, placing the newborn in the arms of an exhausted but radiant Helen. Richard, with tears in his eyes, kissed his wife's forehead and gently caressed his son's head. "He's perfect," he whispered. When news of the birth spread, a wave of celebration took over, not just the hospital but the entire city. In the communities served by the couple's projects, people took to the streets in spontaneous celebration. In the days that followed, Helen and Richard adjusted to the new reality of parenthood. They decided to name the baby Michael, a name that meant "who is like God," a tribute to the miraculous journey that brought them there. The adjustment wasn't easy. Sleepless nights, diapers to change, and constant worry about Michael's well-being added to the already enormous responsibilities the couple carried. One night, while rocking Michael after a feeding, Helen looked at Richard, who was working on his laptop in the nearby armchair. "How are we going to balance all this?" she asked, exhaustion evident in her voice. Richard closed his computer and approached, embracing them both. "The same way we've done everything until now, together, one day at a time." Michael's arrival brought not just joy, but also a new perspective to the couple's projects. Project First Steps gained an even more personal dimension, with Helen openly sharing the challenges and joys of motherhood. In a touching interview when Michael was just 2 months old, Helen spoke about the importance of postpartum support. "Now I understand more than ever how crucial support is in the first months. If I, with all the resources I have, still face difficulties, imagine mothers in vulnerable situations." This honesty resonated deeply with the public. Project First Steps expanded rapidly, including support groups for new mothers, breastfeeding, clinics, and even a community doulas program. Richard, in turn, used his influence in the corporate world to advocate for more generous parental leave policies. "Being a father made me realize how much companies need to support families," he declared at a conference of CEOs. As Michael grew, it became clear that he had inherited his parents' compassion. At just 1 year old, he was a constant presence, during the couple's visits to social projects, charming everyone with his easy smile and infinite curiosity. However, Michael's public exposure also brought concerns. Helen and Richard found themselves navigating the turbulent waters of fame while trying to provide a normal childhood for their son. How do we protect him without isolating him from the world we're trying to change? Helen asked one night, after having to deal with paparazzi during a park outing. The solution came unexpectedly. During a visit to one of the communities served by Project Phoenix, Michael befriended several local children. Seeing the naturalness with which their son interacted, Helen had an idea. What if we created safe spaces for coexistence, not just for Michael but for all children, regardless of their social origin? Thus was born Project Serious Play, an initiative that created playgrounds and recreational centers in areas that united different communities. The idea was to foster social integration from childhood. The project was an immediate success. Children from different social realities played side by side, forming friendships that defied socio-economic barriers. On his second birthday, Michael blew out the candles, surrounded not only by important figures in society, but also by his little friends from Project Serious Play. The party, held in one of the project's playgrounds, was a living testimony to the world Helen and Richard were building. That night, after putting an exhausted Michael to bed, the couple found themselves in their favorite spot, the penthouse balcony. "Did you ever imagine our life would take this turn?" asked Helen, leaning back against Richard's chest. He laughed softly. "Not even in my wildest dreams, but I wouldn't change a thing." Helen smiled, observing the city lights. "You know, when I was a child, I dreamed of changing the world, but I always thought it was an impossible dream. And look at us now," Richard completed, "changing the world one child at a time." As the couple contemplated the future, they knew there was still much work ahead, but with Michael as their inspiration and each other for support, they were ready to face any challenge that came their way. The story of Helen and Richard, which began with an unlikely bet, had transformed into a tale of love, purpose, and social impact. And with Michael, they had not just an heir, but a living reminder of the transformative power of love and compassion. The future was bright, not just for them, but for all the lives they would continue to touch. And so, embraced under the starry Boston sky, Helen and Richard dreamed of the infinite possibilities tomorrow would bring. The years passed quickly, bringing new joys, challenges, and opportunities for Helen and Richard. Michael, now 5 years old, had become a vibrant and compassionate child, often accompanying his parents on their visits to social projects. On a sunny Saturday morning, the family was gathered for breakfast on the penthouse balcony. Michael, with a serious expression that didn't match his childish face, looked at his parents and asked, "Mom, Dad, why don't some children have homes?" Helen and Richard exchanged glances. It was a question they knew would eventually come, but it still caught them by surprise. Helen took a deep breath before answering. "Michael, dear, not everyone has the same opportunities in life. That's why we work so hard to help these people." Richard added, "It's like when you share your toys with friends. We share what we have to help those who need it." Michael seemed to reflect for a moment before declaring with childish conviction, "Then I want to help too." That simple moment triggered a series of events that would take Helen and Richard's work to a new level. Inspired by Michael's genuine desire to make a difference, the couple decided to launch Project Seeds, an initiative that taught children about empathy, social responsibility, and volunteering from an early age. The concept was simple but powerful. Children from different backgrounds would come together to learn about social issues and participate in age-appropriate volunteer activities. Each child would adopt a cause and develop mini-projects to help. Michael, of course, was the first participant. His chosen cause: helping homeless children have toys and books. "Every child should have something to make them smile," he explained, with the simple wisdom that sometimes only children possess. The launch of Project Seeds coincided with Michael's entry into kindergarten. Helen and Richard had carefully chosen a school that valued diversity and social awareness. Still, they worried about how their son would adapt to a more structured environment and how other children and parents would treat him. "Do you think they'll treat him differently because of who we are?" Helen asked Richard the night before Michael's first day. "Probably," Richard admitted, "but we've raised him to handle it, and we'll be right there with him." Their concerns proved partly founded. Some parents were overly eager to befriend the famous couple, while others kept a suspicious distance. However, Michael, with his natural openness and lack of pretension, quickly made friends without regard to whose parents were who. One afternoon, during a parents' meeting at the school, Helen overheard a conversation that shook her. "Of course their son is so well adjusted," a mother was saying. "With all their resources, parenting must be easy for them." Instead of getting angry, Helen saw an opportunity. At the next meeting, she volunteered to lead a discussion on the universal challenges of parenting. "Money can buy many things," she said to the group, "but it doesn't buy patience at 3 a.m. with a teething baby, or the right words when your child asks why the world isn't fair. We all struggle, we all doubt ourselves, and we all want what's best for our children." That honest conversation turned critics into allies. Soon many of the parents were actively involved in Project Seeds, bringing their own children to participate. As the project grew, it attracted attention from educators nationwide. Helen and Richard were invited to speak at education conferences, and schools began implementing their curriculum. At home, Michael continued to grow into a thoughtful and kind child. Despite his privileged life, his parents made sure he understood the value of work, gratitude, and giving back. On his 6th birthday, instead of gifts, Michael asked guests to bring donations for the children's shelter his parents had recently opened. The mountain of toys, books, and clothes collected that day filled an entire room at the shelter. "Are you sure you don't want to keep any of these for yourself?" Helen asked her son as they sorted through the donations. Michael shook his head decisively. "I already have enough toys, Mom. These are for kids who don't have any." Helen felt her heart swell with pride. Looking across the room at Richard, who was helping Michael organize a stack of books, she caught his eye. The look they shared said, everything. Despite all the challenges, despite the constant scrutiny and pressure, they were raising a child who understood what truly mattered. That night, after tucking Michael into bed, Helen and Richard sat in their favorite spot on the balcony. "You know what amazes me most?" Helen said, sipping her tea. "How naturally he embraces compassion. There's no artifice to it, no sense that he's doing it to please us or for show." Richard nodded. "That's because he sees it as normal. To him, helping others isn't something special or extraordinary, it's just what people do." "We've created quite a legacy, haven't we?" Helen mused. "Not just the projects or the foundation, but him. Michael is the best thing we've ever done together." Richard put his arm around her shoulders. "And we're just getting started. Imagine what the next 5 years will bring, the next 10. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the city, lights twinkle below, both were thinking the same thing. From the most unlikely beginning, a rash bet made in pride and anger, had come this extraordinary life. A life not just of privilege but of purpose. A life not just of taking but of giving. And at the center of it all was a little boy who, without even trying, was teaching them new lessons every day about what it meant to be truly rich. The following morning, as Michael bounded into their bedroom at an hour that could generously be called dawn, jumping onto their bed with the endless energy of a 6-year-old, Helen and Richard exchanged a sleepy but happy glance. This was their real achievement, not the millions in their bank accounts, not the successful businesses, not even the thousands of lives they'd helped transform. But this, a happy, healthy child with a heart as big as the world. This was their masterpiece. As Michael grew, so did the reach and impact of the Martin family's projects. By the time he was 7, Project Seeds had expanded to over 50 schools across the country, teaching thousands of children about social responsibility and compassion. Richard, leveraging his business acumen, had created a network of companies committed to ethical practices and community investment. The Martin Standard, as it came to be known, became a certification that businesses aspired to achieve, proving they met rigorous criteria for social responsibility. Helen, meanwhile, had published a book about their journey titled From Streets to Suites, A Journey of Purpose. The memoir became an instant bestseller, with all proceeds going to their foundation. Her authenticity and willingness to share both the triumphs and challenges of their path resonated with readers worldwide. But perhaps their greatest joy was watching Michael develop his own interests and passions. While he inherited his parents' compassion, he was very much his own person. At 7, he showed a remarkable talent for music, taking to the piano with natural ease. "He gets that from neither of us," Richard commented one evening, listening to Michael practice a simple Beethoven piece with surprising skill. "Maybe it's from your grandmother," Helen suggested. "Didn't you say she was musical?" Richard nodded, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "I wish she could have met him. She would have adored him." Family remained a complex issue for both Helen and Richard. Helen's parents had died when she was a teenager, leading to the circumstances that eventually left her homeless. Richard's relationship with his parents, wealthy but emotionally distant people who had never approved of his wasteful philanthropy, remained strained. When Michael asked about his grandparents, they told him the truth in age-appropriate ways. "Sometimes families are complicated," Helen explained, "but family isn't just about who you're related to by blood. It's about who loves you and who you love." This philosophy extended to their broader community. The Martins' home became a gathering place for a diverse extended family of friends, colleagues, and beneficiaries of their programs. Sunday dinners often included everyone from corporate executives to former homeless individuals who had successfully completed their training programs. Michael thrived in this environment, learning to be comfortable with people from all walks of life. He was as at ease chatting with the CEO of a Fortune 500 company as he was playing catch with the children at one of their community centers. As he approached his 8th birthday, Michael came to his parents with a solemn request. "I want to start my own project," he announced over dinner one night. Helen and Richard exchanged glances, trying not to show their amusement at his seriousness. "What kind of project did you have in mind?" Richard asked. "I want to teach music to kids who can't afford lessons," Michael explained, his voice growing more animated. "Ms. Peterson says I'm really good at piano, and I could help teach beginners. And maybe we could get other teachers to volunteer too." Helen felt a surge of pride. "That's a wonderful idea, Michael. Let's think about how we could make that happen." Within months, Michael's Music Matters became the newest initiative under the Martin Foundation umbrella. Starting small, with just a few donated instruments and volunteer teachers at one community center, it quickly grew as Michael's enthusiasm proved contagious. By his 9th birthday, the program had expanded to 5 locations, offering free music lessons to hundreds of children who otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity. Michael himself spent every Saturday morning teaching beginning piano to a group of 5- and 6-year-olds, displaying remarkable patience and encouragement. "He's a natural teacher," commented Victoria, who remained a close family friend. "He has your compassion, Helen, and Richard's ability to inspire others." The project brought a new dimension to the family's work. Research had long shown the benefits of music education on academic performance and emotional well-being, particularly for at-risk youth. The Martins began to incorporate arts education more broadly into all their initiatives. One evening, as Helen was tucking Michael into bed, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mom, are you and Dad famous because you used to be poor?" Helen sat on the edge of his bed, considering how to answer. "That's part of it," she said finally. "People are interested in our story because it's unusual, but I hope we're known more for what we've built together and the people we've helped." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Tommy at school said his dad told him you only married Dad because of his money." Helen felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. "What do you think about that?" she asked instead of reacting. "I think Tommy's dad doesn't know you," Michael said simply, "because anyone who knows you knows you're not like that." Helen hugged him tightly, marveling at his wisdom. "You're right. Sometimes people make judgments without knowing the whole story. What matters is that we know the truth." Later, she related the conversation to Richard, who reacted with less equanimity. "Who is this Tommy's father? I should have a word with him," he said, pacing the bedroom. Helen laughed. "And say what? How dare you question my wife's motives to your child?" "That would go over well." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just hate that Michael has to deal with this stuff." "He handled it beautifully," Helen assured him, "better than either of us might have. And it's good for him to learn that not everyone will see our family the way we do. It's preparing him for the real world." As their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Helen and Richard began planning not just a celebration of their marriage, but of the decade of work they had accomplished together. What had begun as a rash bet had evolved into a mission that had transformed thousands of lives. The gala they organized brought together supporters, beneficiaries, and partners from around the world. But the highlight of the evening wasn't the impressive fundraising total or the famous performers who volunteered their talents. It was when Michael took the stage, unplanned and unrehearsed. 10 years ago, he began, his voice clear despite his nervousness, "My mom and dad met in a way that most people wouldn't expect. Their story could have been just about them, but they made it about everybody. They taught me that when you have a chance to help someone else, you take it. Not because you have to, but because it makes the world better. I'm really proud to be their son." There wasn't a dry eye in the house as Michael walked back to his seat. Helen and Richard, overcome with emotion, embraced their son between them. "When did you prepare that speech?" Helen whispered. "I didn't," Michael admitted. "I just decided I wanted to say something." In that moment, Helen knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever criticism they might face, whatever obstacles might arise, they had succeeded in what mattered most: raising a child who understood the true value of their work and their lives together. The legacy they were building wasn't just in buildings or programs or policies. It was in this child who would carry forward their vision in his own unique way long after they were gone. And that was a success beyond any measure they could have imagined when their unlikely story began. As the Martins approached their 10th anniversary of the Martin Foundation, a new challenge presented itself. The economic landscape was changing, and funding for non-profit organizations was becoming increasingly competitive. Some of their corporate partners, facing financial pressures of their own, were scaling back their charitable contributions. Richard, ever the strategic thinker, proposed a bold solution: the creation of Martin Impact Investments, a fund that would invest in socially responsible businesses while generating returns that could help sustain their non-profit work. "It's the next evolution of our model," he explained to Helen one evening. "Instead of relying solely on donations and grants, we create a self-sustaining ecosystem that generates both social impact and financial returns." Helen was initially hesitant. "I don't want to dilute our mission," she worried. "What if the pursuit of profit, even with the best intentions, compromises the work we've been doing?" The discussion continued for weeks, with both partners respectfully considering each other's viewpoints. Michael, now 10, occasionally contributed his own perspective, often cutting through the complexities with childlike clarity. "If businesses can help people and make money, isn't that better than just helping once and being done?" he asked during a family dinner debate. His question helped crystallize their thinking. Together, they developed a rigorous set of criteria for their impact investments. Companies would need to demonstrate measurable social benefits, ethical practices, and alignment with the foundation's core values. The launch of Martin Impact Investments marked a new chapter in their work. They began funding entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds who had innovative solutions to community problems, from affordable housing technologies to accessible healthcare platforms. One of their first investments was in a company founded by Peter, the young man from Helen's former street community who had discovered a talent for graphic design years earlier. His tech startup developed an app connecting freelance creative professionals from underserved communities with businesses seeking diverse talent. "From homeless to entrepreneur," marveled Helen at the launch event for Peter's company. "If that doesn't embody everything we stand for, I don't know what does." As their professional reach expanded, the Martins remained committed to keeping their family life as normal as possible for Michael. Now in 5th grade, he faced the typical challenges of pre-adolescence, compounded by his family's public profile. "I don't want to be known as Michael Martin, son of famous philanthropists," he complained after a particularly frustrating day at school. "I just want to be Michael." Helen and Richard understood his frustration. They had worked hard to protect his privacy, limiting his appearances at public events and declining interview requests that focused on their family life. But they couldn't entirely shield him from the reality of their public status. Being a Martin comes with both privileges and responsibilities, Richard explained gently. "It's not always easy, but it gives you opportunities to make a difference that most kids don't have." "But what if I want to do something different when I grow up?" Michael asked. "What if I don't want to run the foundation or be in business?" "Then you'll do something different," Helen assured him. "Our job isn't to create a mini version of us, it's to help you become the best version of yourself, whatever that looks like." To help Michael explore his own interests, they encouraged him to participate in activities outside their foundation's orbit. He joined a competitive swim team, continued his piano studies, and developed a passion for astronomy, spending hours with his telescope on the penthouse roof. Through it all, the core values that had guided Helen and Richard's journey remained at the center of their parenting: compassion, integrity, and the belief that privilege comes with responsibility. As their impact grew, so did interest in their story. Hollywood came calling, with producers eager to turn their unlikely romance into a feature film. After much consideration and family discussion, they agreed, with conditions. They would have approval over the script, and a significant portion of the film's profits would go to the foundation. The movie, titled From the Streets to His Heart, premiered to critical acclaim and commercial success. While some critics found it overly sentimental, audiences responded to the authentic portrayal of two people from different worlds finding common purpose. At the premiere, walking the red carpet as a family, Helen found herself reflecting on the long, strange journey that had brought them here. "Did you ever imagine that day in the park that we'd end up like this?" she asked Richard as they posed for photographers. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I thought I was making a business deal. Instead, I found my purpose." Michael, standing between them in his first tuxedo, rolled his eyes good-naturedly at their public display of affection, but the pride in his face was unmistakable. Later that evening, after Michael had gone to bed, Helen and Richard returned to their favorite spot on the penthouse balcony. "You know what I realized tonight?" Helen said, looking out at the city lights. "Our story isn't remarkable because a rich man married a homeless woman." "No?" Richard asked, curious. "No. It's remarkable because two people who had every reason to distrust each other chose to believe in something bigger than themselves. Everything else, the foundation, the projects, even our family, grew from that one choice." Richard took her hand, the same hand he had shaken all those years ago to seal their initial bargain. "The best bet I ever made," he said softly. As they stood together under the stars, both knew that their journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to make a difference. But whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything since. That fateful day in the park, together with purpose and with the unshakable belief that love, properly directed, could indeed change the world.